The old John Deere sat parked outside the co-op
These old
elevator,
Deers, they'll
hood
run
up,
forever
a
if you
coil
treat
of
'em right.
wire hanging from Russ Calder's hand.
Just got to know how to listen.
Dale
to 'em.
Brennan's brand new combine idled 20 feet away, tires taller than Russ's shoulders,
He'll get there eventually.
paint still showing showroom gloss.
Old Russ just hates to
Dale's
rush.
son Tyler leaned against the cab door, watching Russ work with the kind of smile people wear when they already know how a story ends. "What'd that set you back?" Tyler asked, nodding at the tractor. "New fuel solenoid, right?" $35, Russ said, not looking up. "Part and a trip to the parts counter." Tyler laughed. Not cruel, just certain. $35 on a tractor that old is $35 you'll never see again. That machine's worth more as scrap than as equipment. Dale didn't laugh. He just shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he's already made up his mind about someone else's future. "Serious operations don't run on borrowed time, Russ," Dale said. "You keep patching that thing together. One of these years it's going to cost you the whole season." Russ closed the hood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said nothing. Nobody standing at that elevator that afternoon, not Dale, not Tyler, not the two other farmers loading trucks nearby, had any idea that 11 years later, Russ Calder would be sitting across a table from the Brennans, signing papers to buy the very land they'd built their operation on. Nobody knew how a $35 repair would end up mattering more than any of them could imagine. This is that story. If stories about farmers who refuse to quit mean something to you, subscribe to this channel. This is where we tell the real ones. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Russ Calder was 41 years old, though the sun and the wind had put a few extra years into his face. He farmed 240 acres of corn and soybeans in eastern Nebraska, land his father had worked before him and his grandfather before that. Flat, fertile ground along the Platte Valley that had fed 3 generations of Calders without ever making any of them rich. When Russ's father passed, he'd left Russ the land, a modest equipment line, and a farm operating loan that still had 11 years left on it. There was no cushion, no second income, no family money waiting in reserve. Russ farmed with his wife, Denise, who kept the books and worked part-time at the county extension office, and their 2 kids, who were still young enough to think driving the grain cart was the best part of harvest. Russ knew engines the way some men know scripture, not because he'd studied them in a classroom, but because his father had put a wrench in his hand before he was 10 years old and told him a farmer who couldn't fix his own equipment was a farmer who'd eventually go broke paying someone else to. That lesson had stuck with Russ longer than almost anything else his father ever taught him. What Russ didn't have was margin. Every dollar on the farm had a job already assigned to it: seed, fertilizer, diesel, the loan payment, groceries. There was no room for waste, and even less room for mistakes. The Brennans farmed just under 6,000 acres on the other side of the county line, and they'd built that operation the way a lot of successful farms had over the previous 3 decades, buying out smaller neighbors as they retired, financing new equipment on favorable terms while interest rates were low, and reinvesting almost everything back into expansion. Dale Brennan wasn't a cruel man, and he wasn't a fool. He'd watched commodity prices climb for years, watched land values rise right alongside them, and made the calculated bet that scale was the only real path forward in modern agriculture. His son Tyler, who'd come back to the operation after 2 years at the State Ag College, believed the same thing even more firmly than his father did. They ran newer tractors, a fleet of combines that could cover more ground in a day than Russ could cover in a week, and they carried equipment loans that would have terrified a smaller operation. But their yields were strong, their lender was comfortable, and for years, nothing about their approach looked anything but smart. Russ, by comparison, farmed with equipment that was older than his own children. His primary tractor, a 1979 John Deere 4430 his father had bought used in the 80s, had long since been paid off, which was, as far as Russ was concerned, its single greatest feature. The trouble that morning at the elevator had started 3 days earlier, when the 4430 refused to start in the field. Russ traced it the way he traced most problems, methodically, starting with the simplest possible cause before assuming the worst. It wasn't the starter. It wasn't the battery. After 20 minutes with a test light, Russ found it: a fuel shutoff solenoid, the small electromagnetic valve that controlled fuel flow to the injection pump, had finally worn out after decades of use. It was a known weak point on that engine, and it was, fortunately, a part that hadn't changed much in 40 years. He drove into town, found a compatible replacement at the parts counter for $34 and change, and had the tractor running again before lunch. Total repair time, under an hour. Total cost, $35. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't clever. It was just a farmer doing what farmers had always done, diagnosing a problem, sourcing an inexpensive part, and getting back to work. That night, sitting at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, Russ found himself doing math he hadn't planned on doing. A comparable used tractor with similar horsepower would have cost him somewhere between $18,000 and $25,000. Financed over 5 years, even at a reasonable rate, that was a monthly payment that would have eaten a meaningful chunk of his operating margin. Money that would otherwise go towards seed, fertilizer, or the kind of cash reserve that let a farm survive a bad year without panicking. $35 had solved the same problem a $20,000 purchase would have solved, at least for now. Russ wasn't foolish enough to think that would always be true. Eventually, the tractor would need something bigger, something the parts counter couldn't fix for spare change. But that night wasn't that night. What struck him wasn't the size of the savings, it was what the savings represented. Every dollar he didn't send to a lender was a dollar that stayed on his farm, working for him instead of against him. Denise, going over the books beside him, put it more plainly than Russ had let himself think it. "We're not trying to look like a big operation," she said. "We're trying to still be here in 20 years. That same cost-conscious instinct started showing up everywhere on the farm that season. Russ began tracking fuel use more carefully, noticing that a poorly calibrated planter was wasting more seed per acre than he'd realized. He started buying select equipment parts used instead of new, when the used part carried no meaningful reliability risk. He renegotiated a fertilizer contract after discovering he'd been paying a delivery fee he didn't actually need. None of these changes were dramatic on their own, a few $100s here, a percentage point of efficiency there. But added together across 240 acres, they mattered. It was, Russ realized, the same principle as the solenoid. Small leaks, left unexamined, could quietly drain a farm's margin over an entire season without ever showing up as one dramatic loss. The lesson wasn't that spending money was bad. It was that spending money without asking whether it produced real value was how a farm slowly bled out without anyone noticing until it was too late. The following summer tested every part of that philosophy. A dry stretch settled over the county in July, right when the corn needed rain most. Yields across the region came in soft, Russ's included. To make things worse, a fuel price spike that fall drove up his harvest costs right when his revenue was already down. For a few weeks, Russ genuinely wondered whether his cautious approach was enough. Careful spending didn't create rain. It didn't fix a bad growing season. Watching the Brennans' irrigated pivots keep their fields green through the same dry stretch, a system Russ couldn't afford, was a hard reminder of what money could buy when you had it. But the old tractor earned its place again that fall. When Russ's newer, larger tractor developed a hydraulic issue mid-harvest, the 4430, already paid for, already familiar in every bolt and quirk, stepped back into daily use without hesitation, saving him the cost of renting a replacement during the most critical 2 weeks of the year. It wasn't a triumphant moment, it was just one more instance of the same quiet math. Reliable, affordable, already owned equipment, covering a gap that would have otherwise cost real money at the worst possible time. Over the next several seasons, Russ's approach to the farm sharpened into something closer to a real strategy, even if he never would have called it that himself. He kept the old tractor running for tasks it still handled well, while investing selectively in newer equipment where the return clearly justified the cost. He built a modest cash reserve instead of spending every available dollar the moment it came in. He started doing small engine and equipment repairs for a few neighboring farms during the slow winter months. Nothing large, just enough to bring in extra income and put his mechanical knowledge to use beyond his own fence line. Word got around. Farmers who couldn't justify paying a dealership's shop rate for a simple repair started calling Russ instead. It wasn't a business in any formal sense. No sign, no storefront. But it added a modest, dependable second income stream that gave Russ a little more room to breathe. 5 years in, Russ faced his hardest season yet. A processor that had been buying a significant share of his soybean crop scaled back its purchases, cutting into his expected revenue right as a mild drought reduced his yield for the second time in 3 years. For the first time since taking over the farm, Russ finished a season in the red. It was a sobering moment. His careful approach hadn't been foolproof, and he knew it. Sitting with Denise that winter, going over numbers that didn't add up the way he wanted them to, Russ had to accept an uncomfortable truth. Discipline reduced risk, but it didn't eliminate it. What got them through wasn't a single decision. It was the accumulated effect of years of avoiding unnecessary debt. Because Russ had entered that difficult season with lower fixed costs and a real cash reserve, however modest, the farm had room to absorb one bad year without threatening the next one. Somewhere in that stretch, Russ arrived at the idea that would come to define the rest of his farming career, even though he never said it out loud to anyone but Denise. The real advantage wasn't having the newest equipment. It was understanding which expenses actually made the farm more productive and which ones simply made it look impressive. A new combine looked impressive. A $35 solenoid did not. But over enough seasons, the difference between spending on appearance and spending on genuine return on investment was the difference between a farm that survived hard years and one that didn't. From that point forward, Russ evaluated every purchase, big or small, by asking a simple question. Does this make the farm more resilient, or does it just make the farm look bigger? While Russ was tightening his operation acre by acre, the Brennans kept expanding theirs. It wasn't reckless by the standards of the time. Commodity prices were strong, land values were climbing, and lenders were eager to finance growth. Dale and Tyler bought 2 more parcels over the following years, upgraded their equipment fleet again, and leaned further into the belief that bigger was simply better. For a long stretch, it worked exactly as they expected. Their revenue grew, their acreage grew. From the outside, their strategy looked unambiguously smart, and in fairness, for those years, it was. The pressure came the way it usually does in agriculture. Not all at once, but gradually, from several directions simultaneously. Commodity prices softened over back-to-back seasons. Interest rates climbed, which meant the Brennans' variable rate equipment and land loans suddenly cost considerably more to service each month. Input costs, fertilizer, fuel, seed, rose at the same time revenue was falling. None of these forces alone would have been catastrophic. Together, they squeezed an operation that had built its growth on the assumption that strong prices and manageable financing would continue indefinitely. High fixed costs, which had barely been noticeable during the good years, suddenly became very noticeable when revenue contracted. By this point, Russ's farm looked different than it had a decade earlier, though not dramatically. He'd added acreage carefully, a parcel here and there when the numbers made sense, always paying down debt faster than the loan required whenever a strong season allowed it. His equipment fleet was a mix of older, paid-off machines and a handful of newer purchases made only when the return was clear. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't running 6,000 acres. But he had something the Brennans, for all their scale, no longer had in the same measure. Low fixed costs, manageable debt, and cash reserves, built up over years of resisting the urge to spend, simply because spending was available to him. The call came from a neighbor, not from Dale himself. The Brennans, facing mounting debt service and a couple of disappointing seasons in a row, had made the difficult decision to sell off part of their operation, roughly 300 acres along the eastern edge of their land, adjoining Russ's own property. It wasn't a failure on their part, not really. It was the kind of decision plenty of farm families eventually face: restructuring debt, reducing exposure, making sure the rest of the operation stayed sound for the next generation. Russ drove the property line that weekend, walking sections of ground he'd looked at from a distance his entire life. He evaluated it the same careful way he evaluated everything: soil quality, drainage, access to the county road, realistic yield expectations, and, most importantly, whether the purchase price made sense against what the ground could reasonably be expected to earn. It did. Russ sat down with Dale and Tyler Brennan at the same co-op office where, years earlier, Tyler had watched him wire a $35 solenoid into an old tractor and shake his head about it. Nobody mentioned the tractor. There was no need to. Dale looked older than Russ remembered, tired in the particular way that comes from carrying debt through a hard stretch, not the way that comes from age alone. Tyler, for his part, was quieter than he'd been as a younger man, watching numbers get discussed with the kind of attention he probably hadn't given them a decade earlier. The conversation was businesslike, fair. Neither side postured. Russ made an offer based on what the land could realistically produce, not on any desire to prove a point, and after some back and forth over terms, the Brennans accepted. The morning Russ signed the purchase papers, nobody made a speech. There was no dramatic moment, no acknowledgement of how far the story had come. Just a stack of documents, a pen, and three men who understood exactly what the transaction meant, without needing to say it out loud. Dale shook Russ's hand afterward, and for a moment, something passed between them that was closer to respect than regret. "You always did know how to hang on to a dollar," Dale said. "Wasn't about the dollar," Russ said. "It was about what the dollar could still do for me later." That $35 solenoid never bought Russ Calder 300 acres. No single repair, no single decision. Could have done that. What it did was mark the moment Russ started asking a different question about every dollar that crossed his farm. Not can I afford this, but does this actually make my operation stronger? That question, asked consistently across more than a decade of seasons, good ones and difficult ones, was what eventually put him in a financial position the Brennans, for all their scale and modern equipment, no longer occupied. It wasn't a story about cheap repairs beating expensive equipment. Plenty of times over those years, Russ had spent real money on new machinery when the numbers justified it. It was a story about knowing the difference, about understanding which expenses built resilience and which ones simply built appearance. The old 4430 still sits in Russ Calder's machine shed today, parked beside equipment considerably newer and considerably more expensive. It isn't the center of the operation anymore. Most days, it doesn't run at all. But every so often, Russ starts it up anyway. Not because the farm needs it, but because it reminds him of something he doesn't want to forget. The tractor never made him successful. Learning to see value differently did. This is the Rural Files. Every farm carries a story worth telling. And sometimes, the smallest decision on the ledger turns out to be the one that changes everything that comes after it.